says that everything is in the rules, which, as I said, he changed constantly, adjust the rules a little bit, and as if by the wave of a magic wand, a sense of daring, bravery, rudeness, and even recklessness will appear. Change them again, and suddenly a collective united by a shared idea will be created. Now change them again. Everything is in your power. You are a dramaturg, a constructor, an architect. You are more than a director, much more. So you get this, I mean, a clear kind of continuity with the powerful role for intellectuals in shaping everyday life and remaking man that you see earlier in the Soviet period. But with a very different objective, the sort of goal of individual self-development, as he described again in this lengthy book about the show. So describing the show's kind of questions and its content, he says, rather than focusing on narrow factual knowledge in which a person with some specific education would have an advantage, the question should be designed for a typical person from the crowd. The question should help such a person believe in his or her strengths, convince him or her that with a minimum of fundamental knowledge, he or she can solve any problem that life might place before him. He said that, as he goes on, he argues that professional games, sort of intrigues, really, professional intrigues were gaining importance, and life itself was beginning to require the utmost skill and readiness for conflict. And this is 1982 when Brezhnev dies, and indeed in the Soviet elite there's a great deal of sort of a massive struggle for power and kind of multiple players. Once Brezhnev is already obviously declining from the late 70s onward, as he becomes weaker, indeed at the highest levels of Soviet power, there's a lot of competition. You can play one sort of a boss off of another, and there's much more room for maneuver at sort of elite levels of politics. And this plays down all the way into kind of everyday life, arguably in any kind of government institution or factory environment. There's much sort of more political play, and indeed corruption is also flourishing in this period, which also creates the need for kind of skillful play. And so he proposed of the show, you know, how can a person learn to react instantly to one or another unexpected situation that might arise? How can he learn to keep all of his senses and abilities ready for battle and immediately put them to work? How, after all, can he objectively evaluate himself, his abilities, his strong and weak sides, confirm what he's really able to do? The process of developing and of opening up in a person these necessary qualities is, in my opinion, the highest objective of any important game. So he still has this very ambitious view of what his game is for and what it will accomplish and how it will develop people. And yet the objective of that play is something that's, you know, fully outside of kind of Soviet ideology, at least I'd argue, in the sense that it views Soviet everyday life not as a kind of unfolding move toward communism, growing better every day, but indeed an increasingly corrupt and stressful environment in which individuals must compete and draw on all of their native talents and abilities. So that sort of seems to me one useful way in which to contribute to kind of larger questions about you know, how this is interesting to people who work just on media elsewhere. And finally, let's see. So in terms of kind of understanding, just to shift tracks, because I'm curious what you think about this, and there may be many much more obvious ways to contribute to what we know about television elsewhere than the one I'm proposing. But in terms of kind of understanding the current internet, there's, you know, I found myself on this panel thinking it would be a great idea, but of course then you have to really write the paper. And I remain some questions of how this all can be connected, other than via Grusin and Bolter talking about current digital media as specifically characterized by remediation or whatever. You know, I think the Russian internet is a very interesting place these days. And I think some of this should make us skeptical of claims in Russia in particular, or made here about Russia, about the internet's kind of democratizing power, right? Because it's very common to claim that, oh yes, everyone can broadcast their opinion, and now we will have this inherently, you know, polyglottic, at least dialogic kind of media space. Particularly since, you know, many of these things that are sometimes held up as examples of that were kind of prefigured on Soviet television in various ways. One example that is often used is Putin, Vladimir Putin, now the prime minister, but for a long time the president, since 2000, still extremely powerful, influential figure, would appear live on television. I think he started this in sort of 2001. And chat, even now he does it also with internet chat, sort of to take questions from Russian people and do this kind of whole democratic performance where he responds live. It's always live, and again, live and multimedia, where he would respond live to these kind of questions from regular citizens. And of course, as you might imagine, it looks quite staged, and it probably is, just in terms of their media tradition. As it's gone on, it's become kind of more stage-looking, I think, They'll have groups of people in towns all gather together to give the questions, kind of as a collective. But anyway, he does do this, and it has been made much of as sort of an example of his greater democratic kind of prowess. We have similar events, right? Town hall meetings of various kinds. The difference, of course, being that both sides have town hall meetings here, and when it's only the one leader doing it, right, it's a little more limited. But anyway, this is something they'd long wanted to do on Soviet television, talked about constantly, were never quite able to do. So that kind of cuts both ways. On the one hand, this was a vision that people had of Soviet party leaders responding to audience feedback directly on television. Was a proposal that was made, then they didn't actually do it. So in some ways, it does suggest greater openness. And the other kind of striking feature of the Russian internet, as far as I know, is that it's still heavily focused, as is our own to some extent, and I'm curious what you think about this, on kind of individuals, right, public intellectuals of various kinds, self-made or with government positions or press positions to back them up. So people in the blogosphere, right, kind of with large blog followings. In Russia, most of the blogosphere is on LiveJournal, which integrates kind of social media very extensively. So it's not like Blogger where there are comments, I guess, but anyway, it has more of a kind of commenting social network side to it, as far as I understand it. And it's, you know, it's tempting to make much of LiveJournal's kind of language connections to some of the early Soviet avant-garde cinematography. I mean, I think it would be overplayed, but in Russian it's Zhivoy Journal, and living, live journal, literally, and, you know, live life. Anyway, there are lots of live things about in early 20s sort of Soviet cinematography about liveness and immediacy and all of that. But in any case, I think I probably shouldn't make too much of that. But yeah, so I'm curious kind of what you think about how any of this might be parlayed into some sort of intelligent commentary on current digital media in Russia and/or in the United States, based on your own knowledge. So I'll conclude there. And thank you all for listening. Hi.
I have to duck out, so I'm going to jump in here first. This is great. Extremely interesting. I think what you arrived at in terms of Bolshevism and remediation is what a lot of people have arrived at more recently with that theoretical apparatus. So I had another thought here. I don't know how familiar you are with Lev Nanovich, born in Moscow, digital media theorist, but wrote a book called The Language of New Media. And he uses Vertov as an example of what he calls database cinema.
Oh, yeah. I think the other talk on my panel was about that.
About that.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, especially given how you framed Vertov as, you said, unscripted and sort of catching life by surprise. I mean, Manovich is talking about Vertov in a very, I mean, the whole book is a formalistic sort of approach to new media. But I don't know exactly what you would do with it, but it might be a more fruitful new media lens than remediation, and it would allow you to do. It would allow you to sort of. He crosses over between like film and mostly film, but I think he talks a little bit about television, film and sort of contemporary digital media.
That would be really helpful.
So he uses, you know, he's kind of a film theorist trying to sort of jump into new media. I think the book was published in like 01 or 02 or something like that. It might be helpful, some of the terminology he develops there, because he's building a language to talk about it.
That sounds fantastic.
With Vertov. So, and I think I'll step out there. Let everybody else jump in.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by digital media. I assume you don't mean the transformation of television from being broadcast by radio to being transmitted digitally by cable. I guess you're talking about some aspects, for example, of the Internet. And the Internet, in many ways, is just an elaborate telephone system and is not media in that sense, but I suppose you're referring to perhaps things like YouTube. Would that be an example of digital media? And if so, one of the things that strikes me about YouTube is the extent to which you see individuals put their own homemade videos there, and which is something you don't see in other